A'udhu billah minash shaitanir rajim. We seek refuge in God from Satan the rejected. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Salãmun Alaykum. Peace be upon you. God willing, today we want to start another session, another episode for the studying of the Appendix 1 of Quran, the Final Testament, translated by Dr. Rashad Khalifa, the Messenger of the Covenant. Previously, we covered up to this section that there was table 15, and we got to this point that we understood that there's a number which is also a multiple of 19 in the previous episode. And God willing, today we want to start from this section that starts here on page 388. The number of verses per surah and the numbers assigned to each verse are among the basic elements of the Quran. Not only are these elements authenticated mathematically, but both initial and uninitial surahs are independently coded. Since we are now dealing with the initial surahs, Table 16 presents the numbers assigned to these surahs, added to the numbers of verses in each surah, plus the sum of verse numbers 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus all the numbers up to n. The grand total is 190,133, which is a multiple of 19, and it is 19 times 10,007. So what does it mean? So let's take a look at this table 16 that it is talking about. Mathematical structuring of the verses of initial surahs. So we have 4 columns in this table, and if you pay attention to it, it is concatenated. It means that it is shortened. So it is supposed to be 29 surahs, right? But you only see 5 surahs here. And I thought that maybe it would be a good idea to create like a table in the Google spreadsheet. So before we get to that, I just want to explain what these columns stand for. So we have surah number here, so we have 237, and if you want to know the original number of these surahs, you can go, for example, to table 14, 2, 3, 7, 10, 11, 12, all the way up to 68. So these are 29 initial surahs. These are the numbers of the initial surahs. And then number of verses of every surah. Again, you can check that one here. We have number of verses of every surah. We have 286 for chapter number 2 or surah number 2, 200 number of verses for chapter number 3, 206 for chapter number 7, and so on and so forth until you get to chapter 68, which is 52 verses. Same thing is also correct here. Then you have something here called sum of verse numbers. So what is this? This is the addition of numbers, okay, from the beginning of the verses of that surah until the last number of verse in that surah. For example, surah number 2, we have 286 numbers. So if you go 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6 plus 7, all the way up to plus 285, 286, right? That number becomes this number which is in this column. And if you pay attention, it's a big number, right? It is 41,041, okay? So if you add numbers from 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 200, you get to 20,100. If you go 1, 2, 3, up all the way to 206, you get to 21,321. And you do the same thing for the rest of the surahs as well. And then if you do this and you get a total of each row and the total of this column in the end, you end up with this number, which is a multiple of 19, 190,133, which is a multiple of 19, and it is 19 times 10,007. So how can we make sure that these calculations are correct? I have created this table, and this is the open version of that table, right? That one was the concatenated version. This one is the open version of that table. And I have included all the surah numbers. You can check it for yourself, all the 29 initial surahs, as well as the number of verses, right? And you have the number of verses here for each surah, all the way to surah 68, which is the last initial surah in the Quran. Then the sum of verse numbers. So this is the part that I have entered a formula. It's very easy, okay? This number, which is on this, basically in this row, in this column, right? The number of verses multiplied by parentheses, that number plus 1 divided by 2. It's from number 1, and then it goes all the way to 286. The same formula goes for these numbers as well. For example, you have 200, right? So if you add the same formula here, you see that this number is multiplied by the same number plus 1 divided by 2. And then you can get the whole sum of verse numbers for all the surahs, all the initial surahs. So this is how you can make sure that these numbers are correct. And then the total also is the sum of these numbers for each row, and obviously the sum of all the numbers for the whole column. So if you're familiar with the Excel, or if you're familiar with Google spreadsheet, it's a very simple formula that you can enter to get to the final number. And this is the same number that we have in the PDF, 190,133. So if you look here, 190,133, it is 19 times 10,007, and we have here 19 times 10,007. So this absolutely checks out, and it is a multiple of 19. Subhanallah, praise be to God, Lord of the universe. So this table is absolutely correct. Now, let's take a look at this part. By adding the number of every surah to the number of the next surah and accumulating the sums of surah numbers as we continue this process to the end of the Quran, we will have a value that corresponds to each surah. Thus, surah 1 will have a corresponding value of 1. Surah 2 will have a value of 1 plus 2, which is 3. Surah 3 will have a value of 3 plus 3, which equals 6. Surah 4 will have a value of 6 plus 4, which is 10, equals 10, and so on to the end of the Quran. The total values for the initial and uninitial surahs are independently divisible by 19. The values for the initial surahs are shown in table 17. So now let's take a look at this, see what it says. Now, this is again a bigger version of this one, the left one. However, it is still concatenated. If you pay attention, you see that some of the surahs are not included here. So we have it on the other side. You can just easily check this and see what it says. So what is the first surah in the Quran? Okay, it is surah number 1, right? So surah number 1, calculated value for surah number 1 would be 1, because there is no surah before surah number 1, and that is the first number, right? So surah number 1 should be number 1. Then we move to the second surah, which is the first initial surah in the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah. Starts with ALM, right? Now, the calculated value for surah number 2 would be surah number 1, which is not included here because this is the value for the initial surahs, right? So it would be 2 plus 1. So surah number 1, the value of that, plus surah number 2 becomes number 3. And then next surah, which is surah number 3, which is the second initial surah, its value will be number 3 plus the calculated value of surah number 2, which is 3. So 3 plus 3 becomes 6, and so on and so forth to the end of the last initial surah, which is surah 68. So, and then this number becomes a multiple of 19, 15,675, which is 19 times 825. And how can we check that this one is correct? Now, I have included in the same Excel sheet, which is public, and I am going to leave the link under the video that you can check for yourself. You can download it or use it for yourself. If you click on this tab, it says table 17. And if you go to table 17, I have included that table which is here, right? Which is the concatenated version. I have opened it up and I have spread it out here. I have included all 29 surahs. But how could I make sure that these numbers are correct? So I had to create the whole table for the whole Quran, right? Starting from number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to the last surah in the Quran, which is 114, and check their calculated value. So how does that work? If you look at this table, you would see that we have number 1, which is the first surah. So the calculated number for surah number 1 would be 1. Obviously, there is no surah before number 1. And then the surah number 2, the calculated value for surah number 2 becomes this number 2 plus number 1. So it becomes number 3, right? So if you see, I have created a formula, which I do it until the end of it. I said, like you put the equal sign, this value plus this value, and then did till the end of the table, because I didn't have to do it manually until the end, and I created a formula so you can see it for yourself that these numbers are added to one another. For example, you can check it. 66 plus 12 becomes what? 78, and you have 78 over here, right? And so on and so forth. You can go till the end of it. 120 plus 16 becomes 136, and you go till the end of the Quran, and you get to the last calculated value, right, which is 6,555, which is the calculated value for Surah 114. Now, interestingly enough, the sum of these numbers is a multiple of 19, and it becomes 19 times 13,340. But that's really amazing that this becomes a multiple of 19. And if you just select the values for the surahs which are initial and include them in a separate table, interestingly enough, that also becomes a multiple of 19. That's really amazing. You know, I have included the same values over here on the left side, right? So the calculated value for surah number 2 is 3, 3 is 6, 7 is 28. You can check it on the right and see whether it's the same number. We have 7, 28, right? And then surah 10, the value is 55, right? 10 is 55, and so on and so forth. You can check it until the end of the initial surahs. And this value, which is the sum of the calculated values of these 29 initial surahs, is amazingly a multiple of 19. 19 times 825. So we have the whole surahs in the Quran, right? 114 of them. All of them together, their calculated values becomes a multiple of 19. And then if you just include the initial surahs in one table, they become a multiple of 19 as well. This is just amazing. We have just taken 29 surahs out of there, and their calculated values becomes a multiple of 19. And it is 19 times 825. If you look at the PDF here, you have the same number, 19 times 825. And if you look here, 19 times 825, and the number is 15,675, 15,675. This is absolutely magnificent. This is absolutely mind-numbing. I mean, if you think about it, mathematically, this becomes impossible, but lo and behold, you have it in front of you. You know, this is absolutely fantastic, absolutely mind-numbing. Now, this is only half the story. Now, let's take a look at this part of the last part on this page. It says that the values calculated for the uninitial surahs add up to a total of 237,785, which is also multiple of 19. 19 times 12,515. This is really also interesting, but there is no table for this one here. I have created the table for myself. So if you click on this tab at the bottom, it says uninitial surahs. You will see that on the right hand side, I have included the same table that I had on the other page, which was for all the surahs and chapters in the Quran, right? And on the left side, this time I have included the surah numbers and calculated values of the uninitial surahs. So surah 1 is uninitial. So the calculated value is 1. Surah 4 is uninitial, and it is 10. If you look at it, 4 is 10, and then 5 is 15. You see 5 is 15, and so on and so forth until the end of the Quran. And these are the uninitial surahs in the Quran. And the total sum of these also becomes a multiple of 19, the same exact number that we have on the PDF file. So 237, 785, right? 237, 785. 19 times 12, 515. 19 times 12, 515. This is absolutely mind-numbing. And how can you check that number, that this multiplication is correct? Easily, you can just click on here on your Excel sheet, include this number divided by 19, and then you can see the same number over here, 12,515, 12,515. So that's why you can check it for yourself. I just didn't include it here because I didn't want to confuse you what that number is, but that is the number which is a multiple of 19. If you're familiar with Excel, good for you. If not, it's not a big thing. You can learn it. God willing, I'm going to include this link for you you want to check for yourself, and if you want to share it with somebody, you can share that. But this is absolutely great. So we have the sums of verse numbers for each surah, and the total of all these numbers, number of verses, surah numbers, sums of verse numbers becomes a multiple of 19. Then we have all the surahs in the Quran, the calculated values becomes a multiple of 19, right? Initial surahs, put them together, the calculated values becomes a multiple of 19. And then we have the uninitial surahs of the Quran, and you put the calculated values together, and also becomes a multiple of 19. So this is the end of this section, and I have covered up to the end of page 389, and I think that is enough for this episode. Thank you so much for listening to me. Until the next episode, may God be with you. Salāmun Alaykum. Peace be upon you.